our collective and beyond. So hopefully everyone's okay with that. In August, we're going to have a presence at the Wigan Diggers Festival in Wigan. And in September or October, we're planning to hold an eco-socialist conference, in-person type one, pandemic permitting. And we invite in ideas from others for other actions, really, that we might take in the approach to COP26 in November, where, if possible, again, we hope to have a physical presence. The G7, that rich neoliberal club, of which the leaders will start jetting into Newquay Airport in Cornwall tomorrow evening for a fancy dinner or such like, ahead of the conference itself, are the very nations that have largely caused the dual crisis of ecological disaster and gross inequality of wealth. What can we expect from these leaders? Well, I suggest not a lot. It's already been reported that Joe Biden's proposal for a minimum level of corporation tax of 21% across the G7 countries have been watered down to only 15%, which doesn't seem fair. As a basic rate income taxpayer in the UK, I pay 20%. Why should the G7 corporations pay less than me? And we can expect more of these piecemeal at best type announcements. Nothing that will upset the prevailing status quo will emerge from the conference. So that's my prediction anyway. At the same time, these countries are hoarding vaccines in the midst of a global pandemic, more than they need to hold, which has seen many thousands, probably millions of deaths around the world from the COVID-19 virus. On COP26, we see the warnings from scientists. We see the warnings from scientists on almost a daily basis of devastating climate change approaching. What largely goes unreported is that capitalism's unquenchable demand for endless growth is producing often useless things to make profit for the capitalist class that is driving these dangerous ecological changes. The demands that the Ecosocial Alliance put forward in our open statement are, we think, quite reasonable, modest even. But they have virtually no chance of being adopted by the G7 nations. But that was never the intention of the statement. We were well aware that we would be ignored by the politicians. It's aimed at the people, the general public of the world. Getting them to agree with our analysis is the only hope we have, forcing the hand of these governments to do the right thing. There'll be many groups making similar demands at the G7 conference and COP26, and we will join with them in this. But the idea of this alliance is to promote an eco-socialist analysis of our global problem and put forward eco-socialist solutions to that problem. And I say problem in the singular because we know, as eco-socialists, that the root cause of our social and ecological ills is the dominant world's economic system, capitalism. Only when capitalism is replaced with a more rational economic system, eco-socialism, do we stand any possibility of avoiding disaster. We demand a just transition to a fairer, more sustainable world before it's too late. We hope you enjoy this meeting, and when it's over, you go back to your communities and talk to people. Think about how they can grow this movement. We need to make a very loud noise indeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Mike. And we do have to say thank you to Mike for all the work he's done in getting this together. No small feat. So our first speaker is Romain Phoenix, who's, I think, known to everyone on the who campaigns for eco-socialism, for a better world, for the end of the pollution and destruction that's currently going on, and has been fighting for this for quite some time in many different fields. So Romain, would you like to speak for us, please, for 7 minutes?
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me, and a great thanks to everybody who has organised this Eco-Socialist Alliance. It is essential that we do begin to work together. I know Derek Wall, in his latest book, was it Climate Strike, the Practical Politics of climate change. He talks about the power of weak networks. It sounds a very strange way of describing anything, but I think I would say what it is finding connections, finding ways we can network together. And I think my practical suggestion sort of at the end of this will be that in all our struggles, whether they are local or national, we are finding ways of building forms of solidarity in our communities in different ways. So whether or not it's the Black Lives Matter, football and food banks, and then Palestine all beginning to link together, the more people experience some kind of positive reaction or success, that sense of solidarity, because an awful lot of people have grown up, especially our youth, who have been brilliant with their climate strike action, but as they're growing, these pressures of debts on top of them, or cramping their opportunities, whether it is to travel or live away from their parents, or experience other ways of living together. All the opportunities we have of building the experience of solidarity will help us to have the confidence to get organised, to be able to focus and put our energy into things. And an awful lot of people know and sense that things are wrong, but have never experienced that. And I think that is our challenge. I think it is brilliant that you have got this statement ready for us to take out and share, and that it is written in such a way that we can share that in our workplace, our communities, families, and bring that out, our trade union branches, etc. But what a challenge we've got. The G7 pompously arriving with their fantastic ideas for getting things sorted out. I think, yes, our work is there. There will be some protesters there on the ground, but we can ripple these around wherever we live. So as eco-socialists, we want to make demands for an eco-socialist approach to our world problems, and to demand that they bear that in mind before the COP26 in Glasgow in November. Because so far, they have allowed the free market, as far as climate change and all our climate change campaigning has gone over the last 10, 15 years. They have just been allowing the free market to find opportunities to make wealth in order to produce solutions that will come into play. And of course, that hasn't worked. They've allowed them to explore opportunities for profiteering, which it just means carrying on exploiting aspects of our climate change crisis. So the values that they have used are capitalist values, and we know that they are at the core of the problem that is there for us. Despite all the talk, our climate emissions are rising. And then on top of that, we have the pandemic, we have the refugee crisis across the world increasing, we have poverty and inequality increasing exponentially, and the power is going where the dollars are, and we have the struggle against the mainstream media to get our messages out. And there is so much control, some of it obvious and some of it in the back room, that stops us being able to get an even grip of news outlets. Measuring success by wealth or by nations' GDP is at a core of the problem. And what we've had just today, Mike just said about the sort of the global tax going from 21 to 15%. Well, Rishi Sunak, our very own, how embarrassing is that, Chancellor of the Exchequer in the country hosting G7, the COP26, has just gone on begging for the City of London to be exempt from these global taxation proposals. Exempt. So London could remain a tax avoiding hub and a money laundering centre, despite the fact that we're supposed to be responsible for these next pushes forwards. Despite the fact that no one could be unaware of the nature of the global pandemic, this health crisis, the result has not been humanitarian, it's not been scientific. The profiteering capitalist principle has still been at the fore. It absolutely made me feel livid to think that some countries have been told that you can produce your own vaccine at cost. So therefore, we'll give you the recipe, you can use it for a bit, and then you can pay us for that, even though you've done all the work. It doesn't even see that if things have been done faster and cleaner, if copyrights have been dropped, if the vaccines have been owned by us. I mean, obviously the research and development was funded and underwritten by us, because a lot of the work that was being done wasn't going to end up in a vaccine that might be suitable. And yet, it's been put into the capitalist principles of profiteering. It's also become clearer to us all who were looking around the subject that it's the industrial type of farming, the high profit farming methods that are also going to make these pandemics much, much more likely. And that's to say nothing about the fact that our war machine is using all sorts of methods and things in the background, which might include such things as virus strains, as well as dirty bombs and other ways of controlling populations. But all of that, again, is within the whole capitalist control and power machine. I know I'm going on a little bit now. We should have a patient waiver on the COVID vaccines. We should be keeping all the fossil fuels in the ground. We should be investing in green jobs. I was part of the setup and push for the 1 million climate jobs campaign. That's gone into its third production. We're getting ready now to update that. So again, there will be practical suggestions for people for how a government who really wanted to do anything could possibly start creating these jobs straight away.
Romaine, can I ask you to wind up? Can I ask you to wind up now?
Yeah, okay. I'll say this then. The current targets that we have for meeting climate emissions reductions, the net zero by 2050, we have to be very careful, and more of us need to be aware and to spread that word that a lot of this is based on things that cannot help us. The promise to protect us, not going over 1.5 degrees global warming limit, but half of the global emissions reductions that they're talking about are reliant on technologies that either don't yet exist or that they have not worked out how they could be scaled up. But there are people who have done the maths, they've done the stats, they've done the graphs, they've created these things. These things cannot help us to reach those targets. And bioenergy, biomass is one of the major things. When you look at the destruction being caused, what's being called waste wood and etc., these things in actual fact can become greater contributors to global warming than coal. The stats are there. Let's have a look at them. I would suggest look at Fight the Fire, Jonathan Neal. He's got an awful lot of great detail in there. I mean, there was a quote from him I had, but it's something like, we've got a great job on our hands. We may not win, but we've got a good fighting chance and a really tight timetable and window. I think what we need is the energy, the passion, feed it with some of the facts, get the stats out there. We're going to have to create our own media to do this. And so I think we're a good group. We've made the Socialist Alliance. There are others around. We do need to make those international links and link all of the struggles around the globe and bring everything together so that it become clear that it is the capitalist crisis at the root of all our problem.
Thank you very much, Romaine. That was really good. Thank you. And I think maybe we do need at the end to try and pull together any recommended reading and events that people want to share. Our next speaker is Jim Hollinshead, who teaches at Liverpool John Moores University and is a member of Left Unity. Jim.
Thanks, Felicity. Hello, comrades. It's fallen to me to talk about the extinction crisis, but you can't really talk about that in isolation. It's intrinsically and intimately linked to the climate, economy, environmental and emerging disease crises, all of which nested crises are themselves driven by the core problem, as we've already heard, of capitalism. It's estimated that the global extinction rate is currently tens to hundreds of times worse than the average over the last 10 million years and is accelerating. I could use up my allotted time several times throwing out statistics, but at least I think some context is necessary, whatever kind of an audience that you're speaking to. An estimated million species, based on an estimated 8 million total, are currently threatened with extinction, many certainly within the lifetimes of most of the people within this virtual room. 40% of known amphibian species, a third of all known reef-forming corals, sharks and their relatives, and a similar proportion of marine mammals are currently faced with extinction. Around 1,500 of the 10,000 known bird species currently face extinction. Of terrestrial, freshwater and marine vertebrate, invertebrate and plant species that have been studied well enough to make an assessment, on average 25% are faced with extinction. Around 10% of insect species, which make up 5.5 million of the 8 million estimated species, are faced with extinction. And in the UK, over half, 56% of all species, have declined since 1970. All these species are intrinsically valuable in their own right, with the right to live their best individual and species lives. But it's sometimes argued that species have always and will always go extinct. And does it really alter anything if the wart-biter cricket or the horrid ground weaver spider go extinct? The answer is yes, because biodiversity isn't just a buzzword. It's crucial to the proper functioning and stability of ecosystems at every level of complexity, locally and globally. More diverse ecosystems tend to be more stable and more resilient to disturbance. Many species also play keystone or engineer roles within ecosystems. Lose them and the rest of the system falls apart. As the climate changes and weather pattern shifts, the envelope of conditions to which species are adapted are shifting at a rate much faster than species can evolve to tolerate new conditions. For example, species adapted to temperate conditions need to move to higher altitudes or latitudes, up or north, following their shifting envelope. Those already as far up north as they can get have nowhere to go. Those which can't easily migrate or adjust their distribution or are hemmed in by human development will face extinction. Remember too that protected areas such as nature reserves, sites of special scientific interest and so on can't migrate. Species whose food animals or plants disappear or decrease are in serious trouble, like many seabirds around the UK coasts. Species whose breeding cycle is timed to the emergence of particular flowering plants or seasonal abundance of prey, such as, for example, caterpillars, are in serious trouble when the timing of those events shift significantly, as we've seen this spring with, for example, a blue tit in the UK, whose breeding has been disrupted severely. Catastrophic weather events, floods, droughts, wildfires, and so on, have increased in frequency and severity. Many species and ecosystems need the disturbance of such events to function. But increases in frequency and severity have been shown in recent studies from Australia and the US to decrease biodiversity, to simplify and homogenize ecosystems and communities, and place their long-term stability and survival at risk. Others adapted to more stable environmental conditions are badly affected by the change, even destroyed as functional systems. The homogenization of landscapes by large-scale intensive agribusiness, with its preference for large-scale monoculture, high inputs of pesticides, synthetic fertilizers, and veterinary pharmaceuticals, has taken a severe toll of species. In capitalism, Farms don't exist to feed the world, but for profit. Agribusiness is globalized based on scale of production, reduction of unit costs and vertical integration, and has long since become dominated by massive transnational corporations and production at scale. Vegan, vegetarian or carnivore, unless you grow your own, forget small family farms as being where your food comes from, except in the most economically marginal parts of the industry. Agribusiness does the research, produces the seed, the breeding stock, produces the feed, the fertilizers and the pesticides, produces the machinery and the industrial plant, and increasingly owns the physical farms and the land that they're on. Globally, huge industrial facilities supply more than 90% of meat production. 60% of all mammals on the planet are livestock. It's estimated farm poultry accounts for 70% of all birds. The UK alone saw a 26% rise in factory farming between 2011 and 16, and there are now 800 mega farms in the UK. 7 of the 10 largest house more than 1 million birds, the biggest 2 capable of holding a staggering 1.7 and 1.4 million birds. There are 16 million intensively farmed animals, mainly poultry, in Herefordshire alone, 88 times more than humans. In Shropshire, 15 million, Norfolk, 12 million, and it goes on. In the developing world, the global south, intensive meat doesn't yet dominate, but cow, pig, and chicken production is growing in Brazil, China, Ethiopia, India, Kenya, Mexico, Myanmar, Turkey, Uganda, and Vietnam. And it's most established in Brazil and in China significantly. These produce literally unbelievable quantities, not just of meat, but animal waste, methane and ammonia, and through fossil energy use, carbon emissions. Importantly, these animal populations are very low genetic diversity and never bred on site, with no chance to evolve or adapt to local conditions or develop resistance to any diseases passing through their populations. And of course, all these animals need to be fed and fed a lot. World feed production is estimated at over 1 billion tons annually, generating an estimated annual turnover of over 400 billion US dollars. Soybean meal accounts for 75% of all protein used in livestock feed worldwide. Most comes from the Americas, nearly half from Brazil and Argentina. All this drives ecosystem and ecological destruction and disorganization. 220,000 square kilometers of the Amazon were cleared for agriculture between 2006 and 17 alone. Agricultural deforestation, to support it, contributes a quarter of global greenhouse gas emissions and reduces carbon sinks. And animal farming itself is responsible for 60% of the emissions from agriculture. Because of all of this, human populations come into ever closer contact with wild animal populations, with access to previously isolated and remote areas. And some species, the generalists, learn to exploit agricultural land and human settlement, which I'll come back to shortly. But importantly, wild animal populations are exposed to human contact, predation, and disturbance. Bushmeat refers to a wide range of animals informally hunted for meat. The harvest frequently exceeds sustainable production, and for certain species, this is a significant driver of extinction risk, with 300 mammal species alone threatened with extinction, from which a primary threat is bushmeat hunting. The bushmeat trade feeds workers in forest clearance and infrastructure development.
Jim, can you wind up? Can you have another minute?
Okay. And there's also a growing market in bushmeat to diaspora communities and luxury food markets in the global north. That opens up a whole range of additional problems. We know zoonotic transfer of disease is a problem. Flu, smallpox, measles emerged early on in the advent of agricultural societies. More recently, SARS, again through pigs and poultry, but in a factory farming context, MERS from camels, and Ebola through chimps and gorillas have made the jump into humans. We know that farmed animals can lead to serious zoonotic disease. H1N1 swine flu circulated in pig farms in North America, then jumped to humans, quickly becoming a global pandemic, killing hundreds of thousands of people. Factory farm meat production, as well as horrendous for animals and disastrous for climate, is a public health disaster with extremely high evolutionary pressure placed on pathogens to evolve quickly. Genetically very similar animals are kept at very high population densities in unhygienic conditions with very short lifespans, 5 to 8 months for factory farm pigs, meat chickens about 6 weeks. So the pressure is on pathogens to be highly infectious so as to get out of their host and into a new one before slaughter when the strain dies with the host, and to be fairly deadly, too low a fertility rate and the herd can develop herd immunity, too high and the strain dies out with the herd. The jury's out on whether SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19 has arrived through zoonosis from factory farming, but we know that that has happened in the past, and we know that it's increasingly likely to happen in the future. The US Center for Disease Control estimates that most diseases, new and emergent diseases affecting humans, are derived from zoonosis, from transfer from animals into humans.
Jim, can I ask you to wind up, please?
Yeah, okay. So climate crisis, extinction crisis, all of the nasty crises that we're talking about tonight are driven by the fundamental nature of capitalism. Asking capitalism to reinvent itself as a more environmentally friendly, less polluting, more resource frugal system is to ask individual capitalists or corporations to make themselves less profitable, less efficient, to effectively put a gun to their corporate heads and the whole system. This is fundamentally why climate mitigation has got nowhere or gets commodified. Capitalism and transnational corporations are killing the planet. And we must praise a book by my colleague Dave White, published recently, Kill Them Before They Kill Us. As the statement for this event says, the world and its population needs system change, a just eco-socialist transition from unsustainable chaos of neoliberal capitalism. It's now more clear than ever before that no survivable alternative exists. Rosa Luxemburg characterized the choice as socialism or barbarism. Now the choice is eco-socialism or species annihilation. Thanks, Conrad.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you very much. And there will be time for discussion after the next speaker. The next speaker is Nicole, and Nicole is a member at the moment of Plaid Cymru, and she's a founder of Get PR Done. We're really pleased to have her speaking here today with a long history in these sort of campaigns and the campaigns for a better world. So Nicole, please.
Thank you, Felicity. You'll be glad to know my rehearsal took 5 minutes. So hopefully we'll have a bit of time for questions afterwards. Yeah. So I apologize in advance if some of the things I've prepared have already been covered, but hopefully there's not too much overlap. So I'll get started. The evidence from the scientific community is that business as usual will heat the Earth by at least 4.5 degrees by the end of the century. The last time this happened was 252 million years ago, which triggered a sudden surge of methane emissions, and it caused the 5th extinction. 6 degrees would mean the Earth would become uninhabitable. So just 2 degrees of warming by the end of the century, which is the ambition of the goal of the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement, could see still hundreds of millions of people die of climate-related causes. Coastal cities and whole nations will be swallowed by rising oceans. Heat waves could make areas around the equator uninhabitable, and an estimated 400 million people would live without regular access to water. 3 degrees would bring 6 times as many wildfires as we've experienced recently, and drought would cripple the world food supply. But what matters to business or the capitalist economy that we have is not the amount of deaths or destructions caused by the rise in global warming. It is the reduction of their profit margin and the prospect of an end to their exponential growth. So what is clear since the Paris Climate Agreement signed in 2015 is that leaving the fundamental structural changes to the market that need to be to achieve a zero emission by 2050 to limit warming to 1.5 degrees is to make sure it will never happen. So what is becoming increasingly obvious now on the eve of COP26 in Glasgow is that only governments can take the urgent and dramatic measures required over the next decade to bring about the wholesale makeover of the world's economic profit-driven system. Now, this is a contentious issue probably with eco-socialists, but I agree with Yannick Varoufakis on this, which is that it is time that politicians took control of the economy. Because what happened in the last 20, 30 years, perhaps since the war, really, since the post-war time, politicians have followed what capitalists tell them to do. And the austerity measures in the last 20 years is very clear. But the point is, we still have governments that are elected in our democratic countries. So the whole business of extending democracy is becoming really, really urgent. And this is why I think one of the role of legal socialists is to do with extending democracy wherever we can, whether it's at local level with the People's Assembly, for instance, or Citizens Forum, or any kind of democratic way of controlling local environment and local money budget is something that we should support. Now, this brings me to questions of ideologies and perhaps something a bit more theoretical, but across the political spectrum, mitigating and adapting to climate change has been framed as a problem of scarcity. Now, on the right, people use fear-mongering about taking away people's freedom to consume and the consequences of a slowdown in growth. On the left, the scarcity argument can take on a Malthusian twist, whereby the earth can only hold so many people, added to a puritanical slant, being French, I can feel that, like in the Greens, whereby we need to forego our earthly pleasures to save the planet. Now, I will leave to others to reaffirm the Bellum Eco-Socialist Declaration adopted at the Paris Conference in 2007, and urge everyone to actively campaign for our demands to address the climate, economic, and environmental crisis, as very pointedly outlined in our Eco-Socialist Alliance call on G7 for a just transition in the weeks and months leading up to COP26 climate conference in Glasgow. But I want to leave you with more like lines of inquiries, which I think we need to explore further if we aim to offer a credible alternative to the mainstream reformist Green parties and environmental campaigners, and offer an eco-socialist vision of society for the next generation. My first question would be, how do we reconcile the necessary limitation of growth with meeting the needs of people in developing countries? Second question, would an eco-socialist economy measure exchange value as opposed to surplus value, and address its contribution to society. That's where the feminist in me comes in. Number 3, should we still worry about population growth when the global birth rate is reaching less than 2 children per woman? End of.
Thank you very much indeed, Nicole. That was really interesting. Thank you. Really interesting ideas to follow on. We've now got 15 minutes allocated for discussion. So can I see anyone who wants to come into this discussion, please? Can you raise your hands electronically or somehow let me know in the chat if you can't do that?
Isn't Alan Todd going to speak?
That's fair. He said he didn't want to do a formal contribution because he wasn't feeling particularly prepared, having spent a lot of time on childminding duties. So of course Alan can come in. Sorry, my timer system was going silly. Right. Okay, so we've got Neil Faulkner with his hand up. Neil.
Thank you, Felicity. And 2 points. One is just to underline one aspect of this intersection between ecology and the social crisis, which is absolutely critical for us to get a handle on. The dispossession over the last, we're talking about half a century really, but essentially in the neoliberal era, the dispossession of most of what remained of the traditional peasantry in the global south, and the moving of those people into the mega slums of the global south, and the taking over of the land by transnational capital, by agribusiness, has those 2 things create, on the one hand, the ecological crisis and on the other, social crisis. Central, it seems to me, to what eco-socialists need to be saying is that we want a restoration of the commons. We want a restoration of a world in which the land is controlled by the people and is used primarily for local production, for local need. It's an absolutely fundamental demand of the eco-socialist movement, and it connects us immediately with the struggles of indigenous people in the global south and with the struggles of people who are desperately trying to survive in these mega slums that they have created by dispossessing ordinary people. And we need to be thinking all the time about how we create those connections between ecology and the social crisis. And further to that, just to sort of respond really to what Nicole was asking, I mean, I would take a very hard line on the question of growth. I would say we want a steady state, zero growth economy, and the only way we can achieve that is by an historically unprecedented redistribution of wealth from the rich and corporate capital on the one hand to the mass of ordinary people on the other, particularly the poor of the global south. You can't continue to grow, it's unsustainable. You can't win the argument for steady state, zero growth, unless you take the majority of humanity with you, and taking the majority of humanity with you means you have to address the massive problem of poverty and deprivation and dispossession, which afflicts the majority of people in the planet today. And that means redistribution of wealth on an unprecedented global scale.
Thank you, Neil. Roy is the next person.
Yes, comrades. Well done tonight for pushing this forward, and the other comrades getting involved and taking it forward. Obviously, we're moving to the next stage after G7, which is COP26, and then beyond, because we know that the capitalist class are looking at massive austerity to basically so they keep existing, and we need to win the argument. We need to win the political argument about what in terms of going forward. We need to build this movement. We need to build links and engage with other groups such as the comrades in the trade union movement and other groups, including the youth strike, climate strikers, and also Extinction Rebellion as well. It's clear, as Jim clearly soberly explained what was going on, there is a real serious problem, and climate change is a material condition now. It's not it's not a byproduct or anything, it's a material condition. And comrades and Marxists and others need to understand that's the reality. We have to build the movement as simple as that. We need to engage working class people. I'm working class, right? My situation is the same as anyone else is not the 1% or the capitalist class. We have to build the movement, and this is a really good step forward. But we do know, as Pete Murray's saying on chat, there are other movements taking place, and that's our next movement. That's our next stage, actually, isn't it? To build links with them and build for COP26 as well.
Thank you very much, Roy. That's very constructive. Yes, thank you. The next person with the hand up was Ed Bober. What I'm going to do is take Ed, Alan, and Stephen. That's 9 minutes, and then we'll go to the next speaker. We're a little bit behind time, but we should be okay. So 3 minutes each, please, starting with Ed.
Okay, thank you, Felicity. I just want to mention something about this question that Nicole raised about how do we reconcile growth with the needs of people in developing countries, and it links up with the idea of, you know, do we have zero growth, a steady state economy, and so on. I think the whole capitalist criteria for economic growth of how many percent the economy expands per year and so on, it needs to be destroyed. The criteria for a successful economy for humanity needs to be, are we raising the living standards of the most impoverished people on the planet? Are we developing schools where no schools exist? Are we developing homes where there are no homes for people to live in? Are we developing sanitation services where there is no sanitation? Health services where there is no available medical treatment for people? Green transport where there are no decent transport services. If we can develop jobs by developing those needs for the most impoverished of humanity, we will be developing the world economy, but in a completely different way, according to green criteria. And at the same time, we can actually go about reducing carbon emissions and so on. And of course, that is incompatible with the existence of capitalism, which is hell-bent on simply driving profit, which is mainly about providing consumer goods for people with plenty of money. So it requires a complete inversion of priorities, which requires socialist parties that will socialize the economy and start to begin to plan the resources of human society. That's it, Felicity. Thanks for listening to my contribution.
Thank you. We now have Alan Todd.
Right. First of all, I want to say what a brilliant meeting this has been, and especially thanks to Mike and to Felicity who've got that all together for tonight. I find it very encouraging, and it is a step in the process of reaching out even further. But I would like to respond to a comment that Nicole said. By the way, it's nice to see you again, Nicole.
Yeah.
It's been a combination of factors. Felicity knows something about it. There have been extra granddad duties because, like many people, my son-in-law lost his job when furlough ended. But I've also had a couple of months of not being very well. So I'm sort of slowly coming back in, hence no formal contribution to this one. But no, this is very encouraging. Very, very good, very encouraging.
Thank you. And the next one is Stephen Hall.
Good contributions this evening, but I'm also minded that what is it, the quotation is it Marx about one step in real progress is better than a million or 100 programs, because I don't think at this particular point in time going into finer detail it's what we should be concentrating on, but rather looking at the statement of the producer, the broad sweep of it, and using that as a basis for which to generalise around these issues in a vision of a society which is run on behalf of people, overwhelming majority of population, and that's sustainable, rather than the shit we currently live in. And what I think, this is first meeting I've known of this body. I think it's a tremendous achievement you've got to where you are now. There's some old faces here. I don't mean you're old. I've known for a long time, I should say. Yeah, who are movers and shakers in their area, and I think we've got a good network of people here to strike while the iron's hot and create a big movement around this, because I really do think it's crying out for such an initiative right now. And we should see ourselves as like facilitators of bringing this movement together and getting people work together in a less sectarian than previous manner, in a comradely way, with a view to, let's get the business done. I don't know how old you guys are, but I'd like to see socialism before I die, and let's get on with it. How do we do that? Can we try to concentrate on practical things we can do, like maybe, I don't know, getting more people to sign this statement? How are we going to do that? Who are we going to target? Are we going to organise meetings all over the country about this, why we need to build such a movement, and why it's important we put these demands on world leaders going forward on our own government, and get that debate going, because that's, my daughter is 21, in July, she tells me young people won't get rid of, the hate system, won't get rid of it. So, I honestly, I feel the time to strike now, and we people are in a good position to help facilitate and making this happen. So can we think of ways of doing that?
Thank you very much, Stephen. And I'm going to move now to our next speaker, but I can see that Rob's got his hand up, and I know that Rob's from South Africa. I will, in the second half of the discussion, I will prioritise anyone who wants to speak from outside of the UK. So can I ask David Henson now, who's also not from the UK, to speak? And I asked David when he started, when he said he'd speak, to think about possibly the issues around water, but obviously I want to take it a bit further than that. Thank you, David.
Thanks so much. I think it's a really useful discussion that we're having, and there's quite a challenge in terms of what we see from a scientific basis and what we're going to say in terms of a socialist program on adaptation, mitigation, and transformation, of our capitalist system to ensure survival for humanity and the many species, which have been mentioned. I'm going to concentrate mainly on the question of water resources. Although the question of, see, I've been requested to put my head up. Is that right? I don't want to be too big a head. But to look at mainly the question of water resources and the crisis there, rather than in terms of the crisis in water management systems, which is incredibly unequally distributed throughout the world, and that there are billions of people who still lack access to safe drinking water at any level. And that is, a major health crisis for the world. And I don't even know how the very poor people in our shack dwellers in our cities in Southern Africa and elsewhere, and of those in rural areas, manage to wash their hands when there's no available safe drinking water and water in which to be used, for that purpose. So I'll leave aside the question of the gross mismanagement of water resources through dams, through the privatization of water services and so forth, and rather look at water as a resource. Water is finite, it's inexhaustible, and yet there's, in terms of the water cycle, but it's not always available as, we would want, and making it accessible. to humanity, and particularly to poor people in the global south. 70% of the earth is water, but of that water, 97.5% is salt water, and the fresh water that remains, that is the 2.5%, of that, most of it is on the ice caps, and a lot of those melting. That's where that fresh water is. In other words, there's only 1% of all water available around the globe is in the fresh water state. And most of that is in groundwater. Some 80% of all of fresh water is actually under the ground and accessible only through pumping and through deep wells. So we do see water replenished through the water cycle, but this is a very slow process. And the way in which water is being extracted at the moment is leading to a great and severe crisis in groundwater management and the levels of groundwater, particularly in India, in China, in the Middle East, and also in Southern Africa too, although not quite to the same extent. Some cities are actually declining in their level. For instance, Mexico City and
David has frozen for me.
and Jakarta. Jakarta is declining. Sorry?
No, it's
Okay.
all right. You came back in. Good.
Okay. Groundwater being extracted, in an unregulated manner, particularly in Jakarta, is causing an entire change in the landscape. And eventually, that land may have to be abandoned because of the gross mismanagement of water systems, in that area. Now, if we look at the agriculture, we see, quite how acute the crisis is. We've seen in America, but also now in India and China and many other countries now, deep wells. I mean, wells which are going as deep as 500 meters, to extract water. And that groundwater is really fossil water. It's not recently percolated into the ground, and it's being extracted, in these deep wells at the level of sometimes up to 5,000 liters per day, which is not going to be replenished in any time soon. The aquifer is not a clear lake under the ground. It's rather the waterlogged state of the earth, usually through sand and gravel, under the ground, and it needs time to accumulate and to be able to, to be replenished. There have been innovative systems, say in places like Windhoek, where replenishment has been somewhat accelerated very carefully to be able to provide for cities in a desert state. But there's not much innovation under capitalism, at that level. And so the water, which is extracted from under the ground at quite a cost, is then used, and that then goes back to the ocean. We then have evaporation, rainfall, and then eventually percolation of that rain back into the ground, a very slow and deliberate process. And now to look at what's happening under climate change, we can see extensive changes taking place. We've seen an increase in evaporation and also transpiration from trees at an increasingly rapid rate. With global warming, we knew that there'd be an increase in evaporation, but it wasn't predicted that there would be an increase in evaporation of 10% in a decade. That's an extraordinary figure. And many parts of the world already are living in conditions where there's an increase in the average temperature of 1.5 degrees. And you can imagine, the local climates are even more unpredictable and, in a disadvantaged situation for humanity. And so it takes time, for this water to percolate back into the ground levels. And now we see what I think we all know is that we're seeing a period now of flooding, followed by droughts, changes in the monsoon in India, so that the southwest and the northeast monsoon are sometimes not really separated, which is unheard of previously, and storms and cyclones at an increasingly level and a much heavier level of precipitation, because 1 degree increase in 1 degree Fahrenheit increase leads to something like 4% increase in the ability of the atmosphere to hold water. So we can imagine when that water descends, in the form of rain, we are going to see devastation. So we see an acute crisis now, particularly
David, can you
India.
wind up, please?
Yeah, where and in China, Jordan, I won't go into the details here, but I'd like to then just go on to how we see, our position. I think first of all, it's an absolute crime that you are wasting huge amounts of water. Probably half of the purified water in developed countries and even in undeveloped countries is going towards flushing our toilets. That's absolutely a ridiculous situation, and it's extreme forms of waste. We have to see what ways in which we can apply water storage underground through very well calibrated ways of increasing percolation and storage. We have to see ways in which we can store water. I think Germany has managed to halve its water consumption over the past 30 years. And I think that's something which, we have to look at how we can conserve this vital resource. We have to see in what ways we can extend the wetlands. For instance, in South Africa, the water is terribly abused and polluted through mining. But through an extensive development of wetlands, there has been a way in which water can be purified and released back into the rivers. We have to see in which way we can adjust irrigation to make it more scientifically precise and move away from flood irrigation, which is still taking place and extensively, onto forms of drip irrigation and so forth. We have to see in which ways we can use the downpours which come on monsoon towards water storage underground. There have been small scale experimentation, but we
David,
need to see how that
can I ask you to finish? Thank you.
So the final point, Felicity, is that if we do all these things, we will actually be increasing the productive forces. I want to raise this point because socially necessary activities are not non-productive. We can increase production to meet the needs of humanity, and I think it can be done in a socialist way. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David. We're now open for discussion. Again, Rob has his hand up. If anyone else would like to be in the list of who's going to make a contribution, please put your hand up so I can adjust times accordingly. Rob? Rob? Have I frozen or is somebody else frozen? Rob?
Felicity, you haven't frozen.
Okay. I think Rob is speaking, but he hasn't unmuted. Rob, can you unmute yourself?
We can't
Rob,
hear you.
we can't hear you. Rob, can you unmute, please? I don't seem to be able to unmute him from here. I think we'll have to ask. Oh, Rob's saying software problem. Tried the phone. Okay. We'll give it a couple of minutes, Rob. Bring somebody else in, and then I'll come back to you. Is there anybody else here who's not from the UK who might like to make a contribution right now? I'm seeing we have people from Baltimore and East California and Oakland. Okay, no offers at this moment. So can I just have anyone who'd like to come into the conversation, please? We got something going wrong. Right, something's a bit strange. Is there no one else who wants to make a contribution? Patrick, are you asking to speak?
No, I wasn't actually. No, sorry. I was just suggesting that whether Rob's mic was actually switched off.
Okay, okay. Well, in that case, I know that Pete Murray's been making contributions on the chat. Do you want to have a word on anything, Pete? You're particularly talking about trade unions and work in the trade unions.
No, I just wanted to say that there's been very large attendances of trade unionists at the COP26 forums. I mean, there's statements which are in essence eco-socialists produced by a number of unions and supporters, perhaps more from the mainstream than people in this organisation, not to disparage the people in this organisation. So as a number of people have been saying, we have to work with others on this, and we shouldn't, there's really no point in sort of suggesting that eco-socialism is a kind of a sort of vanguard activity, really. It's if we're going to do anything, we've got to be building a broad movement which involves as many people as possible. And in some cases, as in the case of trying to get PR, not necessarily just socialists. I think that will do for the moment.
Okay, thank you. I would like to assure you that certainly from my point of view and several other people I know here, we are well and truly in the mainstream of trade unionism. You can tell how we look so tired. Romain, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to say something quickly now. I've just got the latest, I think it's the latest environmental quarterly from Unite. And I must admit that it's very heartening. The opening introduction to the quarterly is all about climate change, the COP26, and it's all about getting everyone from all the different sectors in our union and getting everyone together and getting through all the difficulties and talking about just transition, which is, you know, that's always been my dream for at least 15 years now, the idea of sort of a just transition, to make that an everyday concept. And it's something that in Jonathan Neal's book, Fight the Fire, he's talking about we should be quite clear about what it is to start with now, while we've got all these income inequalities, that we should say people in, you know, sectors of all the different trade unions that are in very high powered, very high carbon jobs, let's say you will get paid like for like as you transition into a new sector producing things that address social need. Let's just go for that. That's a suggestion put forward by Jonathan Neal in his book. And I know from my past, they were arguments I used to have with GMB. I'm not saying they're a lost cause at the moment, but there's a lot of work to be done there. And it looks like Unite, and if they get a new General Secretary, as in Howard Beckett particularly, I think we have got, that would be a massive leap towards much more dramatic and radical conversations going on within that particular huge trade union movement. But that's all I was going to say for now.
Thank you very much. Rob, you're back with us, are you?
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. All right. I just had to switch it off and switch it on again, and then it seems to be all right. Yeah, well, this has been a very interesting discussion, and I hope there'll be more like these in future, because I think the challenge of environment will become more and more important for socialists. What I want to do is challenge a very common socialist idea that capitalism will not be able to sort out the climate crisis, that only socialism will be able to adapt sufficiently for economic activity, for the kind of economies that we have, well, not necessarily the economies we have now, but for society to continue. I think if we look at the timeframes, we heard that the current trajectory, it's very open where we're going, but a mention was made of 6 degrees above, I think, 1990 levels, and I mean that would be totally catastrophic. But even 2 or 3 degrees is a lot worse than we have now, and I think what's going to happen is that the evidence of the climate breakdown will become clearer and clearer, and it'll be obvious to everyone, including the politicians and governments, that the world is facing an existential crisis, and that'll translate into an ongoing political crisis, because I think we'll also see more and more activism, demonstrations, and calls for governments to reform and do something concrete to counter climate change. So I think the perspective that we should be looking at is, and this is going to happen in the next, say, 3, 4, 5 decades. And I don't think the forces of socialism are going to gather themselves that quickly that there's a chance of a socialist transformation in that time. I think there are many possibilities with that, but with the climate, I think we know that things are going to get very, very bad in the next few decades. So what we're going to see, or what the younger generations will see, is the capitalism lurching from crisis to crisis and having to find solutions, and being forced to take the kind of actions that scientists have compared will be necessary, and compared them to the actions during the Second World War, where normal economic laws were suspended, the state intervened, and normal economic life was not quite turned on its head, but really reoriented to an external threat. And there's a prospect of using some methods to catch the sunlight before it reaches the earth. I forget the term that's being used. This is serious intervention in the normal climate and kind of natural processes, and people are pointing out the dangers of it. But I think science would have got to the position where governments will be able to do this. So I think what socialists should be looking at is the world heading towards kind of real serious crises, and we'll have to work out ways how we're going to intervene in those crises to counter authoritarianism, and to promote the kind of solutions that will further the aims of socialism and a a sensible and fairly just transition. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rob. Rob, as you can tell from the accent, was speaking from South Africa. Bonnie is going to speak to us from United States, from Oakland. Okay, we always reckon Oakland's rather like Liverpool, sort of the Red Heart. Thank you, Bonnie. Continue.
Yes, thank you very much, and thanks everyone for being here and addressing such important things. I just want to also thank Mike Shaughnessy for saying we need to make a loud noise in Glasgow, and I'm very interested in how we coordinate that loud noise, that articulate noise from an eco-socialist understanding, and the trade unions that are our allies in this. And I'd like to hear if anyone is doing that kind of organizing that will bring out the large masses of people and the ways that we're going to communicate these important ideas when we have that opportunity on a world stage, both in Glasgow and locally here. I won't travel, but I will be organizing with eco-socialists here in Oakland. So I would like to be able to coordinate that so our message is loud and clear. So if anyone can speak to that, I'd be very grateful.
Thank you very much. Right, we have no other speakers unless anyone wants to speak now, in which case I intend to move back. Let me see who have got one more speaker. No, that's Bonnie's hand is still up. I'm going to ask our speakers to come back for two minutes each. And then I want to move on to some organizational suggestions that people have got to make as to what we do next, what we do together next. So if I take it in reverse order, David, do you want to have 2 minutes replying to the discussions?
Thanks, Felicity. Look, I think the question is what program we can put forward. Let me just touch on that. I think science has come up with a number of ways in which we can see the question of water and how it has to remain in public hands, and how we can adapt and mitigate what's happening and adapt to survive. But none of this will be possible if big companies which are targeting water resources, have their way. So, that's an important, but it's also important that we develop our ideas quite concretely. For instance, I've just put up a point about canal irrigation in India. I've been to India and seen, you can actually see almost 1/4 of an inch of crust of salt. It's not just a little bit of salt, it's actually crust of salt on the land through the mismanagement of canals and through centralized control, through Modi's control. So he's tried to close off water to farmers that do not support him and things like that. It's an extraordinary hydrological operation there. But we do have to have our eyes wide open to what's happening and to what's possible, because many of the issues which we are facing are can be mitigated. For instance, the extraordinary waste. Can you imagine us purifying water and then flushing it down a toilet? It's extraordinary. It's bizarre, actually, if you think about it. And it costs us a fortune, to do that. Now we've gone nowhere really in terms of thinking that through, and we've got to come up with solutions. And these are not easy. For instance, when I get in rural areas in Africa, and I asked the people, look, what kind of sanitation system would you want? And we put forward different proposals. The answer is the system that you've got. Whatever you've got in your home, I want for my home. That's a demand of equality. Now, if we had water systems that we have here in where I'm staying right now in Rhode Island or in urban South Africa, it'd be an extraordinary waste of water. We have to, the rich countries or so-called rich countries and the world have to change the way in which we manage our essential resources. And I think we've got to integrate this in programs so that we can come up with with real, I wouldn't say, well, there will be practical answers to some of the most demanding questions of our time. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And the next person we asked to come back is Nicole, please.
There's so much to take in. I'll just pick up on a couple of things. I think it was Roy who said that we've got to be prepared to see a massive push for more austerity. And then we've got another point of view from, oh dear, who was it again? The last speaker, sorry, who said that we could very well see an intervention of the state becoming more and more important as capitalism sort of stumbles from one crisis to another. I think this is something we really need to think about, because if the state is becoming more like state capitalism, no jokes here, please, then our own approach may have to be thought through. I mean, we are seeing governments taking measures to keep people afloat with the pandemic, and they found the money. So are they really going to try and recoup that money when they're going to get some revenue from taxing multinationals and things, the things that we've advocated for the last 20 years? They're doing it, not perhaps as much as we'd like to, but it's the start. They're starting doing it. The governments, international governments, are taking measures to get money out of multinationals to pay for the money they put in people's pockets to survive during the pandemic. So what if we had a situation where increasingly we have a state capitalist type of economic system? How do we move from that to just transition? It might be easier, actually.
Thank you.
I'll leave this.
It has been a really interesting discussion, in the fact that so many ideas have been thrown up. That's very true. Jim, 2 minutes, and you don't have to stick to extinction.
The likelihood of me sticking to 2 minutes is quite remote. Let's see. But anyway, I want to come back on kind of the same point and take up a couple of points which I was unable to make because of time, because of me waffling on during my contribution, and take up the points that Rob Dyer made, and also Nicole just then, to an extent. Yeah, it's true. Capitalism is capable of huge transformations and compromises to keep itself going. As we've seen from the past, it will instantaneously implode. It will not fall over of its own accord. Whilst it's got workers and the environment, they're able to pay the price of keeping it going. Well, all of those evolutions that capitalism has been able to go through in the past, wartime capitalism, although the nationalization of large sections of the economy, have never separated capitalism from the fundamentals of capitalism, because it can't. It stays capitalism, even if it's got a fascist superstructure, even if it's balancing between the forces of the working class and the forces of the bourgeoisie, and having to make all kinds of different accommodations. But what it can't fundamentally get away from is that the problem is inherent to capitalism itself. It's fundamental. It's competition itself, the drive to cut unit costs and increase productivity and increase sales. It's debt and credit that finance competition and need to be then paid for by exploiting ever increasing new markets, new areas of growth, and mass production and so on, which only works if enough goods can be produced at low enough cost to more than cover the cost of investment and profit. So it's got those kind of, it's trammeled in terms of the leeway that it's got to be able to maneuver. Capitalism is fundamentally a mass production and mass consumption system. And wealth increases by increasing productivity. So the mass of commodities made and sold has to increase, and with that, consumption of raw materials and energy, which has to be supported by increasing consumption and production. So it's stuck in that system where even with falls in price, more raw materials, more energy gets used, lowering unit costs and stuff. And producers in general have to follow or be undercut. So really all we're talking about, if we move down that line of analysis, is discussing how long it takes for things to happen, not whether they will happen. How intense will be the reaction? How intense will be the exploitation and oppression of workers? And that,
1 minute, Jim.
Yeah. Markets fundamentally judge everything by price, and markets price and the supply of resources, not the underlying stock of resources. So there's always that drive to overstep the boundaries of the resources within capitalism. So the limit for capitalism to be able to save itself is really, really limited. It can only be temporary, even though that might seem fairly long term in terms of the duration of a human lifetime. We're not talking about generations and generations before capitalism results in a situation, if it carries on in the way it is, where actually the planet is no longer survivable.
Right.
Okay. Okay. So the next speaker, it's the final sort of return speaker, is Remain.
Thanks. I'll rattle through and repeat perhaps a little. Right, so we've had 30 years of governments promising climate change emissions, tackling climate change crisis, but the emissions have risen. We do need mass movements. We need to help support and show solidarity with mass movements growing in the global south. We need to build our own here. Then we need that solidarity between the north and the south. We need to be calling for 100% renewable energy. We need to be calling for regulation of the banks. We need to say no to carbon taxes. We need to say no to fossil fuel subsidies. Moving beyond the market. For those of you who've mentioned various things about getting everyone on board, maybe you don't even have to talk about socialism. That won't be me, but you could say to them that the market hasn't delivered. And this is, even if it has tried to deliver, it's not the cheapest way of doing it. I mean, look at PPE, for goodness sake, in this country with the COVID pandemic. They are promising us targets for 2030, for 2040, for 2050, and they are lies. Our proposals from a Million Climate Jobs campaign and other ideas all around that, our proposals are jobs now. We can start to do something now. We could achieve something close as good as we are hoping for, maybe in 15 years. We can do that now, not with imaginary tech that may or may not come on board, that may or not get subsidized for research, that may not be able to be scaled up without actually being worse than burning coal, which is true in some of the cases with bioenergy and biomass. We can support more campaigns immediately for divestment. The fossil fuel companies are still reaping off as much as they can in profits. All this talk, remember, about the net zero, that is a con. If you look at all the glossy brochures and the big fossil fuel companies, they're still exploring and getting more fossil fuels out to help us until we are ready. This is all lies. but the good, clever money is already moving out because they don't want to be caught out on the stock exchange with values and stuff, you know, dropping. There are very, very technical arguments about why the net zero targets are wrong, but the information, a lot of it is there. We can use it. Thank you, Neil, for bringing up the commons. The commons is at the root of everything. For an eco-socialist future, we need all the basic things about our life. We do need to be able to bring a proper democracy that is rooted locally, regionally, that can then link up further than that, then through nations, if we're still having borders. Yes, obviously we will for a while. And then internationally, we need to get those mass movements for eco-socialist policies, for anti-climate change, anti-exploitation. The refugee crisis through war and climate change is already devastating. There is no responsible approach to that. We're paying off other countries to take people into open air prisons. And then that brings us back to Palestine. We've got the Black Lives Matter movement going on. We have food banks in this country, more of them than McDonald's, and a government that spouts hypocrisy and lies and waffle, and a mainstream media that does nothing to challenge them. So we need to be there and create our own media. Yanis Varoufakis in Greece, when they work towards getting a 62%, we do not accept the next memorandum of cuts from the EU. They said he would never have been able to get to a 62% saying no, tell them no, except by saying to everybody, don't read the papers, don't listen to the mainstream news. All of that is lies. We need to build our medium and our message that way, but also by winning local campaigns, whether it's about evictions, deportations, closing a swimming pool or something else at your local school, whatever it is. Build those solidarity networks locally, people with experience, some confidence, and build from a sense of solidarity they may never have had before, which will then help us, I think, to build that mass movement. Because if it's not properly rooted, and all the big anti-austerity organisations so far have really failed, I believe, in not thoroughly giving support for these movements to build properly on the ground at the grassroots level. That is where we can get it right this time, I hope.
Thank you very much, Romain. Can I add to your list? The fight for the NHS has got to be on a very much a
I'm working
ground.
in the NHS. Yeah,
from the ground up, we have to fight to save the NHS. Only if it becomes a social movement will we save it.
It's our commons, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's something that we own and is being taken from us at the risk of our lives. July the 3rd, folks, those of you in Britain, July the 3rd, big demonstrations locally on the issue of the health service. Right, we're going to move on to the section of the meeting now where we're going to talk about what happens next. The first thing, I think people can agree with this without any degree of disagreement, that we spread the statement. Now, I've put one link to the statement in the chat, which is where it's published on Left Unity's website. It's published on many other websites as well. So spread the word for the statement. Try and get other people to agree to sign it. Mike, do you want to say anything more on that? On getting people to sign the statement?
Yes, unfortunately, the wrong email address went out on the original notice. I think I've corrected it as much as possible where it went, but probably not everywhere. So I think that may have been a bit of a handicap for us.
Shall I put that email in the chat again?
Yeah, I think the original account name was at proton.com, but it should have been protonmail.com. But anyway, I'll say I've tried to say it out as much as I could, but I may have missed some people out. But I think that has probably affected us a bit. But these things happen. This is the start of a campaign, isn't it? You know, and hopefully we'll iron out all these little kind of niggles that we have. I mean, in general, sort of, I think it has been a very interesting discussion, as people have said, and there's probably quite a lot to think about, actually, when we reflect on it all. But for now, anyway, sort of thing, that's probably about all I got to say, I think.
Okay, thank you. I'm trying to type it in. I'm hoping I'm typing it properly. Sorry, I will. Neil's got to go. Sorry, I will try and make sure that that email address gets out to everybody. And remain, yeah. So the second thing I want to say that we are asking people to do while the G7 is in England is to post the little memes that we've produced in social media, picking up the different issues that we've talked about today. I will email them to everyone who got who came through the Eventbrite. I'll email them tonight to make sure everyone's got a copy of them, and just keep pushing them out during the G7 conference. The third thing is that there's a yeah, Alan Knowles is having to leave, sorry. Very quickly through the third thing. The third thing is that the Wigan Diggers are hoping to have an event immediately after the main Wigan Diggers Festival this year. For those of you don't know the Wigan Diggers, it celebrates Winstanley from the literally the diggers of the British Civil War, whose slogan was "The earth was made a common treasury for all." We're hoping that that can be an eco-socialist conference, but again, we'll send people details of that and ask people to take part in it. And I think the next thing we should say is we try and have another meeting like this and try and make it at a time when it's possible to get people from the Global South to take part in the Zoom meeting. So it'd have to be kind of, you know, a weekend in the sort of 4 o'clock-ish if we're going to get people from India and Pakistan and Sri Lanka into those meetings. So are people happy with that next stage? We're talking as well to people from Scotland about actual organisation in Glasgow, and we're involved with the European left interventions into Glasgow as well. So we will circulate all of that to you. And I think, as everyone's now saying they've got to go, the chat is full of people having to leave. So thank you very much to everyone who's come. It's been a really good meeting, and thank you so much for coming. If you haven't got in touch with us, please do, and we'll make sure we've got your email for future circulations. Thank you very much indeed, and I'll close the meeting on that note. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well done, Felicity.
Bye-bye. Good
Bye.
night. Thank you.
Bye. 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 Thank you. It is recording, and I'm stopping the recording now.